video plays will actually have sound. I also want to thank Ellen and Beth for organizing this and making it so easy to get here. Is that better? Better? Okay, I have to lean probably here. Hello? Ooh. Okay, alright. I'll just hold this. Okay, so I wanted to thank Ellen and Beth and everybody who was involved in organizing this, including the janitorial staff and the people who provided the delicious lunch that we had. We're not named, but we're here. And also the carers who are making it possible for me to be here. My 14-month-old is at home, and my partner is taking care of her, as well as two amazing babysitters this weekend. And it's basically his niceness that lets me come to a conference every time that I don't have a kid. I'm encumbered by care, which is not encumbrous, but yeah. So what I want to talk about today is the new visibility of transgender, gender non-conforming, and queer people as political subjects of reproductive labor, and to consider how the racializing politics of devaluation inform even the political frameworks that seek to see trans and gender non-conforming subjects within political discourse. Everywhere I look, people are talking about the transgender tipping point and celebrating trans visibility, and yet a clear counter-discourse exists, especially in social justice movements, that positions trans people, and in particular trans women of color, as the most vulnerable and dispossessed, or potentially, as I'll explain, as paradigmatic of transnational capitalism and the state's worst injustices. And this is post the gay marriage movement, right? So post the gay marriage movement, where a lot of the LGBT kind of organizations consider the gay rights movement to be an end. So what I want to say, though, is that we need to relate this moment in queer and trans politics to social reproduction, partially because questions of reproduction are central to understanding how transnational crisis capitalism continues to find new ways to impose austerity on certain populations, while offering the aspirational fantasy of work as the only way to improve one's circumstances, but also because struggles around social reproduction are relevant to every other struggle. And as Celia Federici and Camille Pappagallo, who I think is also here today, have argued, because the ways that we connect with, make, remake, and support ourselves and each other determines the success of the movement. Quote, no struggle is sustainable that ignores the needs, experiences, and practices that reproducing ourselves entails. Yet, as Martin Manalansan, as well as others have pointed out, writing about reproductive labor too often understands women as the only subjects of these struggles and assumes the heterosexual or nuclear family form as the crucible of social reproduction in both a positive and a negative way, right? So in an essay called Queer Chain of Care, Manalansan points out that the care chain and care drain theories characterized by, for instance, Hochschild and Ehrenreich in the book Global Woman assume a heteronormative household structure, both the middle-class elites who pay for care work and the immigrant immiserated laborers or performing care work. So it's really true that neoliberal capitalism still depends on heteronormativity as one of its main discriminating instruments, right? And I think you only have to look at, as a parent, like, because I've been we've been kind of immersed in parenting discourse for the last year and a half, and you only have to look at the kind of mommy wars or the kind of fetishization of attachment parenting as, which is a kind of new way to enclose carers or mothers in the home and to relate care work to biological capacity. But now as a neoliberal lifestyle choice rather than a structural imperative. Yet, trans people and queers are also having children, they're restructuring families, and often because of economic structural imperatives, people in queer families forced to or voluntarily somehow reproduce these kind of structures in their daily lives, right? So we have also like the kind of creation of a whole array of new markets which cater to queer reproduction, like assisted reproductive technologies, surrogacy, transnational adoption, which create kind of new structures of transnational asymmetry. A lot of this is already piggybacking on the existing structures and markets. So, however, when we assume that reproductive and affective laborers are heterosexual women, we risk missing the point that capital generates value through exploiting difference as well. Madeline Sun guides me here by asking what happens when we, quote, decenter biological motherhood and its naturalized domesticating, or remove biological reproduction from the game. What if we include such queer creatures as gay men, single and married women with no maternal instincts, and transgender people into the mix? So I depart a little from Madeline Sun's instructive work here, precisely because transnational capitalism already offers multiple modes of which heteronormativity and gender determinism are kind of in conflict or in contradiction. And in fact, gender-determined subjects are being hailed in some quarters as the paradigmatic subjects of capitalist and state immiseration. It's the complexity of that inclusion, both in left theories of labor and within social justice movements, that seem timely, and that I'm working on as part of a larger project and what I'm going to talk about today. So the first part of the talk is about biopolitical vulnerability, or vulnerability as a kind of biopolitical production. Transgender as a category of personhood has recently become administratively visible within international human rights regimes as something that renders subjects particularly vulnerable and that also requires governmental and bureaucratic literacy. Just as the cultural shift towards trans visibility in the United States is rife with contradictions, so is this administrative shift, right? So simultaneously, in North American queer and trans political worlds, trans women of color, trans immigrants have been named repeatedly as the most vulnerable or precarious subjects within social justice politics. And a huge amount of this thinking, and even the fact that we can articulate that, has come out of queer and trans prison abolition work, and projects that are dedicated to serving people who are most targeted by institutional and extrajudicial violence, and a lot of that is led by trans women themselves. But the focus on trans women of color as movement leaders, but also as having a category of most remainder or most vulnerable, has now been moved beyond that into the larger political context of progressive queer social justice organizing and nonprofits, and even to the center, to the kind of political center, right? So an instructive example is the Obama press conference last year that was interrupted by Vanessa Gutierrez, who's an undocumented trans activist, just after the Supreme Court had voted to legalize same-sex marriage. And as Gutierrez pointed out, even Obama in his speech is now talking about trans women of color being targeted with violence or discrimination, yet trans immigrants face violence and abuse in ICE detention centers. And after the predictable disavowals of Gutierrez by mainstream LGBT activists, what people weren't talking about was the very fact that Obama is talking about trans women of color. And so that language is filtered through to become a sign of acknowledging diversity or acknowledging intersectionality. So to illustrate also what I mean by this, I want to show a clip from a film called Transgression, which is also about trans immigrants in detention. It features the story of Mama Rivera, who's a trans immigrant to the United States, and whose story of surviving U.S. Immigration detention forms the main narrative of the film. It was made by an intern with an LGBT lobby group called Immigration Equality, and it's distributed by YouTube and Vimeo, and it's also being reportedly shown in ICE LGBT training workshops, which I find really frightening. So Aaron Morris and Victoria Nielsen from Immigration Equality appear as experts, and then Norma tells her story.
On LGBT immigration issues. One of the policy issues that Immigration Equality has been really focusing on for the last 2+ years is how ICE houses transgender detainees.
They're very vulnerable. They're very vulnerable to sexual assault. They're very vulnerable, generally they're placed with other populations. Sometimes they're placed with criminal populations. Sometimes they're actually placed with sex offenders. So that they're already vulnerable from the general population. And there, a lot of times there are people who just don't understand what it means to be trans. A lot of them have had gender-affirming surgeries, breast augmentation for women. That they are women, or they are a trans woman is a woman. And if you put that person in a population with all men, it's just a disaster. So DHS, in an attempt to make it safe for the trans person, will often pull them out of the general population and isolate them.
The problem with that is administrative segregation generally means that the person is locked up for 23 hours a day. It means that they go through great psychological harm. They don't get to socialize with other detainees. It can be much more difficult for them to have visits with family, friends, or even with counsel.
So I'm making a strategic decision here not to show you the footage of Loureiro herself, who's shot, and a lot of the footage is her crying as she relates her story. There's a kind of coercive requiring of this narrative to happen that I don't want to reproduce here. So Morris's words, they are very vulnerable, speak to the situation that trans and gender non-conforming detainees face when they're placed in gender-segregated facilities. However, his words also reduce Loureiro, and by extension, trans Latinas and trans people of color in general, to a generalized vulnerability that could be said to define them. If vulnerability has been a powerful way to account for how people are affected by the material wounds of neoliberalism, Morris's indication of vulnerability also defines trans subjects through that wounding in a way I argue is much less useful. And in another paper, I give a really extended reading of the film, but I just wanted to show that small clip. Vulnerability is also a biopolitical category of transgression. It accrues from the on-camera tears of trans immigrants encouraged to testify to their own traumatic histories of family abuse and to the U.S. nation's freedom and tolerance of diversity. Loureiro's visual and affective vulnerability as an undocumented immigrant is cinematically produced through its contrast, and she is filmed against in this really dark room with dark red curtains that is a total contrast to the way that the experts are filmed in their offices in a very light environment. So it's cinematically produced through its contrast with the redemptive white nonprofit expert and advocate who stands in for the progressive American nation. Vulnerability here becomes a method to extract value in the form of spectatorial sympathy, and this extraction of value serves to conceal the reality, which is just as the U.S. government is assisting some transgender subjects to gain asylum and refugee status, or get some kind of residency or citizenship. Other or the same trans and gender non-conforming bodies are rendered disposable by an immigration reform agenda that seeks to detain and deport criminals. And the way that Morris talks about trans women in detention being placed with criminals or even sometimes sex offenders erases and effaces or makes a distinction between those two kinds of people, when a lot of the time trans women are profiled or are criminalized as sex workers and charged with sex work offenses and then end up in immigration detention as criminals or as sex offenders. So what is happening here is the documentary, bent on a respectability narrative, is refusing to even talk about sex work. But the reality that sex work is a popular way of making money for trans women of color who are often refused involvement in other labor sectors, and that law enforcement at all levels profiles trans women of color by charging them with sex work offenses. Within this discourse, trans women are posed by vulnerability to violence and displacement, makes them candidates for increased protection or rescue on the one hand, often in the form of a homo-nationalist desire to save those in the global south from the mutated barbarism, quote-unquote, cultural backgrounds. But also, on the other hand, they're held responsible as bad subjects who need to be rescued from their own deviant behaviors. So this is coming at reproductive labor and trans politics in a kind of different way, and theorizing sex work as reproductive labor. So what happens when trans and gender non-conforming people are finally incorporated also into critiques of political economy? Paul B. Preciado's Testo Junkie does just this. And a hybrid work, it's a book that came out in 2008 in French and then was just translated into English last year. So in a way, I'm working at a complete lag here because I didn't read it in French. A hybrid work combining an autobiographical account of taking testosterone with Preciado's theory of what he calls the pharmacopornographic regime. Testo Junkie moves over some of the same theoretical ground as I've been working, but from a very different place, and it does so, or he does so in this particular passage that I'm going to read by reading Marx via Vienna to argue against the post-autonomous theorization of general intellect. Preciado writes upon Virna's observation that Marx has a problem with the indistinction between intellectual labor and quote, servile labor, work where the product is not separable from the act of production, work that has to be performed over and over again, and thus does not produce surplus value, i.e. reproductive work. But rather than moving towards immaterial labor and general intellect as paradigmatic of post-Fordism, Preciado poses sex work as paradigmatic of the pharmacopornographic regime, hypersexualized capitalism. And he kind of plays with this idea of general intellect by having a subject having general sex, and then goes on to explain that sexual labor, like Virna's theory of virtuosic labor, requires communication, cooperation, but of a specifically corporeal character, not a kind of just verbal character. And I'm going to quote a little bit from the book. In this context of exploding sexual reproductive forces, cooperation between bodies absorbs all other types of productive labor in a way that makes all commodities simultaneously an incitation to sexual pleasure and the frustration of that pleasure. The pleasure of the multitude is the ultimate source of the production of wealth. So it does seem crucial, as Preciado does, to make this intervention into post-autonomous Marxism, to think about the role of sexuality as labor, and to acknowledge sex work as immaterial and reproductive labor. And also, at the same time, to refuse the valorization of reproductive work that takes place within the family, as opposed to sex work. Not least, Preciado understands sex work as a crucial part of primitive accumulation, value extraction, that creates and reproduces systematic geopolitical commiseration. So he's also interested and mentions the kind of racializing aspects of this process. And what he calls the pornification of labor creates subjects who are inherently vulnerable, rendered into bio-machines, stripped to the sum of the body parts that fulfill John's desires. Sex work occupies a similar structural position for Preciado to prisons and the entirely unregulated zones of overseas contract workers. And so I'm going to read out another passage from the book. The ideal sex worker, a high-tech cocksucking machine, is a mouth treated with silicone that is silent and politically subaltern and belongs to an immigrant cis female or transsexual without access to administrative identity or full citizenship. The sex machines of the third millennium are living bodies denied entrance into the political sphere, deprived of public discourse, stripped of union rights and strikes, and lacking medical care or unemployment benefits. Unlike for traditional Fordism, there is no longer any competition between machine and worker. On the contrary, the worker is becoming a sexual bio-machine. So what I find interesting and kind of questionable about this theorization is grim depiction of racialized trans and non-trans sex workers as entirely without political power or agency. Preciado understands sex workers as entirely outside citizenship, and this is somewhat surprising if only because the people that he talks to in the book or interviews are famous porn stars like Jenna Jameson, who kind of cites a couple of times, who enjoy celebrity status and relatively high paychecks, and they're kind of in a relatively, kind of high status sector of the sex work industry. He's right, of course, to point to the racializing instrument of the border regime to terrify and disempower immigrant workers in order to destroy their capacity to organize. However, citizenship is envisioned as the inside, the table at which trans people, queers, and sex workers should be sitting at. And trans embodiment is central to Preciado's theorization of the quantification of labor. He draws on the international history of violent homicide meted out against trans women of color sex workers to make his point. Yet it's indicative of Preciado's liberal humanist leanings that he assumes people on the outside of democracy and citizenship have nothing. So in a way, it's kind of a tricky point that I'm making because people, trans and queer of color theorists have made exactly this point, but in really different ways. Most notably through Magabe's notion of necropolitics, and the term trans or necropolitics or queer necropolitics is circulating at the moment, in particular to kind of describe this dilemma. To write of queer or trans necropolitics marks a moment in which intersectional analyses reveal, yet again, for a new generation of thinkers and activists, how the state's institutions appear to eagerly consign queer and trans populations to disposability. As Jen Heridawarn and Riley Thornton point out, the most vulnerable gender nonconforming bodies subject to institutional abandonment almost always occupy a position as racialized, either to the nation or to whiteness, whether as migrants with precarious access to social administrative citizenship status, as people of color trapped in the institutional enclosures of anti-blackness, as inhabitants of the structurally adjusted global south, or as the colonized subjects of multiple imperial wars. But Preciado's textual pleasure in enumerating the destitution of the sex machines of the third millennium here forms a very different operation. Finding a logical conclusion in the description of complete abjection, rather than looking to the formations of resistance that sex workers and trans people engage in, Preciado reproduces a pornographic gaze, and in a way it strikes me as a kind of gesture to ethnographic immediacy, right? His words evoke the solicitous, concerned tone of Aaron Morrison transgression, but with a more sexualized spin. And reproducing European philosophy's desire for the paradigmatic, the subject of labor par excellence, Preciado also indulges in a hypersexualization of trans people, inadvertently by describing trans or immigrant sex workers as machines. He reproduces the humanist racial hierarchy and imagines them as such in the first place. So one of my points in offering this reading of Tester Junkie is that proposing any labor form is the paradigmatic neoliberal kind of, is paradigmatic of neoliberal capitalism is kind of a fool's game. Its meaning is philosophical, and it doesn't necessarily contribute to a politics, right? Preciado doesn't say what the political solution is. This passage ends, and another chapter returns to autobiographical narrative. Even without a program, though, it's notable that even in a book I would understand as deeply anti-capitalist and anti-statist, uninterested in the recognition forms of medicalized transsexuality, Preciado tacitly points towards state solutions of recognition, inclusion, and citizenship. And I think I've outlined the perils of vulnerability as a biopolitical form that happens precisely through kind of like incitement to inclusion, right? Incitement to citizenship. The entire sex work rescue industry offers another instructive lesson in how the spectacle of sex work and commiseration can be deployed in the service of increased border restrictions, criminalization of sex workers, and women and trans people in general, and sex peddlers. So my larger point is that even with money, people still organize. Politics happens in the spaces designated outside citizenship. It's only invisible to those who don't have opted to notice. Preciado describes the sex industry as one of two domains in which workers are entirely deprived of civil rights. He ignores the long history of sex workers organizing to fight criminalization, ways to harassment, stigmatization, and for better working conditions and access to healthcare. For example, I recently showed some students of mine, I wanted to show a film about sex work. It wasn't terrible. Sometimes really hard to find one. And I finally realized that I wanted to show them Tales of the Night Fairies. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't, you should. Which is about the Durga Mikula Samaya Committee, a collective of 6,500 sex workers of all genders in West Bengal, India. And then there's a whole lot of other sex worker unions, right, across the world, and advocacy groups that are fighting to improve their conditions. And not necessarily, I think that we could argue about that people wanting citizenship or recognition strategically, but that's not in the end necessary. So another lesson is that sex worker politics and thinking about sex work as reproductive labor are integral to trans and queer politics. Claims for trans recognition that rely on respectability politics and claims to normality are only going to sell out the populations who need an end to violence most, right? And this was particularly, I'm going to end without reading out, but this was particularly evident to me 2 years ago. I was living in Arizona randomly for a job, and I met a person called Monica Jones, who ended up becoming her campaign to get charges dropped on a solicitation charge or a manifesting prostitution charge by a lot of media. And it was in Phoenix, Arizona. It's like a huge city, but a tiny, tiny community of sex worker activists. And Monica was arrested by an undercover cop who she asked for a ride. And then, taken to this rescue that was during a sting by a rescue project working with the police over a weekend to funnel people into kind of rescue or services, right? She'd already been picked up, and so she was ineligible for the rescue kind of 6 sessions of therapy or whatever it was that they were trying to get her to do. So she was taken to the police. And over the course of a year and a half, probably about, I would say 3 to 4 people, maybe 5, who were actually on the ground in Phoenix, and then a whole host of other people who were in the States and internationally, worked to get Monica's charges dropped. And it created a precedent that means that you're not necessarily, like, there's, that it's much more difficult to make charges of manifesting or soliciting go through, but also it created a lot of press around trans people being profiled as sex workers just for walking around the street. And the kind of phrase that's come out of that campaign is walking while trans, and so that's just one example of what people are doing that is not kind of directed at trans recognition or queer recognition in a kind of citizenship sense, but is about decriminalization. And part of the why they were so efficient in organizing and finding those charges was that it was a very small, kind of 3 or 4 member chapter of SWAP there, the Sex Worker Organizing Project, who are also working in a broader way to decriminalize sex work. So yeah, that's all I've got. I should have a nice conclusion, but I'm really bad at conclusions. So